the first day of the picture, I tore my hamstring, so I've been limping along and trying to do the best I can with a lot of help from about 9 different doubles.
That's right. Well, we should call this film Gimp and Limp.
You know.
Tango and Cash was born from the mind of a big producer named John Peters during the 80s. Peters was a bigweight at the time, known for producing such films as Rain Man, Inner Space, Witches of Eastwick, An American Werewolf in London, Caddyshack, and the upcoming Batman. John Peters' business partner was Peter Guber, and the two hired Randy Feldman to write a script about 2 cops that were framed and sent to prison. The first title of this film was called Setup. Originally, the project was supposed to be the event of the 80s, in which Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone would finally team together, but it didn't work out that way. Instead, the project turned out to be the major teaming of Sylvester Stallone and Patrick Swayze, who was just off the canceled Dino De Laurentiis Total Recall. And we covered all this in our Total Recall coverage. But then Swayze said no and decided he would rather make Roadhouse instead, and that meant they needed a replacement. Stallone remembered approaching Kurt Russell around 1983 because he wanted him to be in a project called 50-50. The project didn't fall through, but Stallone remembered him, and within a week of Swayze leaving, Russell was on the project. In March 1989, Canon veteran Andrei Konchalovsky was signed to direct, and this was when Swayze dropped out. When he was brought on board, Andrei said he was directed to deliver a buddy cop movie with some humor. The planned budget was around $35 million. During casting, Brion James was called in by the director. In the past, he was interested in casting him on his other film, Runaway Train, but he didn't make it into that film. James sat with Stallone and Russell during the casting process, and they liked him. After he was cast, it dawned on James that he was going to work with these big actors, and he wanted to rise to their level. So, while he waited for principal photography, he created a Cockney accent and practiced it often. He thought, then rather than just playing a run-of-the-mill tough guy, he would add something to this part. Terry Hatcher was not always the choice to play Tango's sister. Originally, Daphne Ashbrook was to play the part of Tango's adopted sister, but thanks to the constantly changing script, the character changed into a biological sister, and the studio thought that Hatcher looked like a person that could pass as Stallone's sibling. The script was not where it needed to be when filming began. It had gone through many stages and constantly evolved. One script doctor was Jeffrey Boam, who was a veteran of the Lethal Weapon films. He was uncredited for the first Lethal Weapon, but he got full credit for Lethal Weapon 2, and he also worked on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Inner Space, and Lost Boys. While working on Tango and Cash, Boam was under contract with Warner Brothers for $3 million, and he was one of the studio's staff writers. His specialty was action and comedy, and so when he was called to work on Tango and Cash during various levels of development, including while in production, he stated one of his early versions was long, incredible, and awful that didn't change anything conceptually. He stated he created many rewrites, and he didn't like the film, and therefore did not want a screen credit for his work. Just before production, Randy Feldman turned in another revised draft dated May 30th, 1989, and honestly, this was the most up-to-date script when the production began filming. It was 121 pages, and it had no ending, so it was suggested the film would be around 2 hours and 10 minutes. This was no good, and the studio wanted it shorter, so there could be more showings to make more money. Usually, we would cover the script at this point, but this movie is a bit different than our other film series, as the finished version of Tango and Cash is not a deep film with an eye for detail. It was action scenes connected by witty dialogue and humor with no intention of taking itself seriously. It's just a fun popcorn movie that you sit there and delight in. As a result, when we do our deep dive, we'll be looking at the script and how different it was from the final product, and we'll go into all of this in part 2. With that said, this script was not embraced by all when the film started production 13 days later. As filming started, more rewrites occurred not only by Feldman, but Stallone as well. Filming began on June 12, 1989, and right from the start, the production of the film was in disarray. Lines and scenes changed daily, and within the first week, the first cinematographer of the film, Don Peterman, who left apparently due to a family crisis. But when new cinematographer Barry Sonnenfeld came on set, he learned that Peterman left for different reasons because Andrei helped Sonnenfeld understand that Peterman didn't have a family crisis. He was just fleeing a sinking radioactive ship. In their first talks, Andrei described a proposed ending for the film, where Sly and Kurt would get free, then commandeer a Jeep in the back of the plane, and drive out of a plane, which was an Antonov AN-225 plane on loan from the Soviet Union. Sonnenfeld wanted to know if this scene would be a combination of filming the real plane, using a blue screen, or on a studio. And Andrei apparently got frustrated and started screaming. "Why are you asking about all these tricks? Why are you wasting time with questions? I just told you the scene. You read the script. Your job is to film the scene." Now, Barry knew his job, and he asked the tough questions, and he stated that Andrei seemed temperamental and not able to understand his job. When filming a police station scene, Andrei came up to his cinematographer, not liking what he was seeing. He said the scene wasn't lit properly, and really felt agitated and ill-tempered toward Sonnenfeld. Frustrated that the shot wasn't interesting enough, Andrei turned to Russell and directed him to say something funny to people as he walked into the shot when passing them. Russell apparently had enough of all this and said, "Andrei, I'm an actor, not a writer. If you have a writer, write me funny things. I'll say them. But don't ask me to say funny things if they aren't written." So this was the job Sonnenfeld walked into. And Sonnenfeld was no slouch, as he already worked on films like Raising Arizona, Miller's Crossing, When Harry Met Sally, and Throw Mama from the Train. After Tango and Cash, he would go on to direct such films as The Addams Family, Men in Black, Get Shorty, and Enchanted, which is a pretty impressive resume of success. Still, Stallone would be the one who fired Sonnenfeld within a week of him starting the job. To replace Sonnenfeld, Stallone selected one of his favorites at the time, Donald E. Thorin, who Stallone recently worked with on Lock Up. According to some sources, Stallone tried to direct Sonnenfeld on how to light the set, but Sonnenfeld ignored him, knowing his job already. Stallone is quoted saying that he fired Sonnenfeld because he simply wasn't good enough. Then there was producer John Peters making the shoot difficult. Peters was known to be a temperamental man that threw insults and foul language whenever he could. He kept telling the director to make the movie like Lethal Weapon, but Andrei wanted it more serious and character-focused. You will see some of this in the script during part 2. Andrei stated Peters' demands were increasingly insane and more slapstick. It was Peters who came up with the idea of Russell being in drag, and since there was no ending to the film, Peters was stuck in traffic one day, saw construction vehicles working, and then he became obsessed with making action scenes with big vehicles at the end of the film. Of course, Peters would get what he wanted in the end. As the shoot went on, Stallone and Andrei worked well together and agreed that the film should be more serious than slapstick. Despite this, there were rumors on the set that stated Stallone was doing some shadow directing of his own, and Andrei didn't make a stink about it. So, the star didn't make a stink about him. Stallone seemed supportive of the director, but after a month and a half of shooting, Andrei and the producer, John Peters, refused to speak to each other. Most sides state that Stallone was in the middle of all this, and was noted by multiple sources that he would be a constant voice of reason on the set, despite having a big ego. While filming, Kurt Russell and Sylvester Stallone really gelled and had a lot of fun together. Some stated they didn't get along because whenever Stallone made decisions, he focused on his character and diminished Russell's role in the script. However, there is much evidence to suggest otherwise, especially some of the stories where Russell and Stallone would play fun pranks on each other during filming. For example, when Russell was dressed in female garb, he went to Stallone's trailer and stuck his leg in, pretending to be a lady to mess with him. That doesn't sound like something you would do to someone you hate, but I digress. In the end, you have to decide for yourself based on what little info we have. Although Stallone was very straight in his approach, Russell was extremely relaxed. Their chemistry was amazing, and all of their interviews from that time are extremely fun to watch. And even in 2017, Stallone would sneak up on Russell during interviews, and they would hug, joking with each other.
Whoa!
Hey, dude, just a minute, we'll be back.
I didn't. You grew so tall. My God. All that clean living in Aspen. Look at him.
Come on up. We gotta get those of you in
it's a
here for a
step.
second.
When Brion James came on set for his first scene, he came ready to chew up the scenery, with his accent practiced and perfected. They loved it. They played off of it. They got into it. Stallone started rewriting the script. The script wasn't really ready. I wound up being on the film for 14 weeks. My part went from a few days to much bigger. So I became the main bad guy and not Jack Palance. It should be noted that Brion James was only supposed to be in 2 scenes. One where Tango follows him to the setup, and 2 where they find him and do the grenade gag to make him spill the beans. Jack Palance threw himself into the role and embraced the villain's over-the-top demeanor, but as James was quoted, Palance's role grew smaller in favor of his henchman, Requiem. And how did Palance feel about it? This had to be just about the worst experience I've had working on a film. He would go on to say he didn't like working with the guys, but refused to specify who, though he did say Russell was nice. He said he got the script and he said he liked it, but then he never saw Stallone once. He continued to say this.
You didn't get along with Stallone in the film?
No, the only thing that I would say is that these guys who've become stars now, I mean, they're the most arrogant bastards that I have ever worked with. The ego is bigger than mine, and I couldn't believe it.
Really?
Of course, he could be joking, and like we always say here, you gotta decide for yourself. With the feud between producer John Peters and the director growing, it was just a matter of time before one of them had to go, and the opportunity came when the film went over budget and behind schedule. The film was projected to finish on August 25th, 1989, and Peters made his move when they passed it. Those in the production stated that the director was given impossible scheduling demands, and when they fell behind, Peters exploited it for his benefit. Now, Andrei states that Stallone was his protector, but one of the actors stated that Stallone got him fired because he was protective over his own movie and got his own DP. So the studio had to justify it and fired him, saying it was the director's fault. It wasn't his fault. They didn't have a script. I was even rewriting it at the end of the day, over and over. After 3 months of filming during late August 1989, Andrei was fired by producer John Peters after a final dispute which was over the movie's ending. Andrei would confirm this by stating he and Stallone wanted a realistic and serious ending rather than a campy one, which was goofy, like the one John Peters desired. This was stated in his 1999 biography, Elevating Deception. Besides Andrei speaking about all these things I mentioned above, actor Brion James would later confirm all this in interviews around 1999. However, we wanted to give you more sources that talked about the set beyond just the director and Brion James. We found 2. A crew member gave this quote about the situation of the film. "This was the worst organized, most poorly prepared film I've ever been on in my life. From the first day we started, no one knew what the hell anyone was doing. He found himself in over his head. There were scenes scheduled for 3 days that were so complicated they should have been scheduled for 6 or 7 days. They were trying to do a 22-week movie in 11 weeks. And this wasn't the only quote we found about the film. Line producer Larry Franco said this, "Tango and Cash was the most screwed up show I ever worked on, and I worked on Apocalypse Now." Behind schedule and out of a director, executive producer Peter McDonald would step in temporarily as he was already the film's second unit director, and Stallone liked him because he helped him finish Rambo 3 a year before when production issues arose there as well. Stallone also dabbled with with the director chair at this time as well. Then Albert Magnoli was hired, and filming finished in September. Magnoli was known for music videos and for directing Prince in Purple Rain. Magnoli filmed all of the chase and fight scenes at the end of the movie, and he fully embraced the campy action style Jon Peters desired. This caused a major shift in the overall tone of the movie, and as a result, more serious scenes filmed earlier had to be cut in favor of more comedic ones. Then Warner Brothers execs saw dailies, and they kept complaining. So Magnoli called everyone back to the set for 2 more weeks of filming. During this time, a new beginning was made for the film. Filming officially wrapped on October 20th, 1989, 2 months behind schedule. The film was expected to release in theaters in just 8 weeks. Though Andrei was fired by producer Jon Peters for going over budget and over schedule, Peters got what some claim just desserts when Warner Brothers had enough. The studio fired him alongside his partner, Peter Guber, and both of the producers decided to take the studio to court, citing they were terminated unfairly, and Peters even went so far to complain that the studio advanced the release date of the film by many months. As post began, the bigwigs at Warner Brothers scrutinized the cuts. One of their issues was violence. They wanted to ensure an R rating and wanted the gore in the film turned down, so in the finished film, most of the death scenes were cut away from. Yet whatever the editors did, the execs kept complaining, so they called in one of their editor doctors, Stuart Baird, who was called on in emergencies. Baird got to work, and ironically, he would also be called in to clean up Demolition Man during 1993 due to the same production problems. The entire film changed under Baird's editing. Whole action scenes were cut, and the story changed as huge chunks of the film disappeared. We will cover some of this when we get to the movie itself. Baird changed so much that they had to hire new composers to keep changing the score for the film. Harold Faltermeyer and Gary Chang would work to the last minute on a score keeping up with Baird's cuts. It was a good hire because the score for the film is a big part of what gives it the personality it needed for the final print. The last-minute changes got so bad that the film was edited right to the film's release. Theaters were shipped wet prints, and in Hollywood terms, that means it barely finished before it released. Because it was so rushed, I can't cover merchandising because there was no merchandising, no book, no score, because the movie was such a cluster that there was no time to make merchandise. When Tango and Cash finally made it to theaters, its budget ballooned to $54 million, which at 1989 was one of the top 10 most expensive movies. It was released on December 22nd, 1989 in 1,600 theaters. November and December of 1989 was an astounding time for films, with many memorable and long-enduring movies. Films like Look Who's Talking, Steel Magnolias, a profound new start for Disney in their excellent Little Mermaid, the great return of Marty and Doc in Back to the Future 2, the timeless return of the Griswolds in National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, and the dark gritty comedy The War of the Roses. They were all in the top 10 slots, slugging it out when Tango and Cash arrived. The week before Tango and Cash released on December 15th, 1989, there were 6 new films thrown into the mix, and because of such variety, films with big stars didn't matter. Such big star vehicles that really didn't do great was Robert De Niro and Sean Penn's We're No Angels, as well as Paul Newman's Blaze. The big surprise was that Dustin Hoffman, Sean Connery, and Matthew Broderick's Family Business just made $12.1 million, proving that star power meant nothing for this season. The Wizard was designed to specifically target teens and younger kids, but it was ignored mainly by families so they would see Little Mermaid instead, or the more popular Back to the Future sequel. It would make a fair $14.2 million, but that was a disappointment because Nintendo invested in this film, hoping that video game fans would flock to see the movie because it had new footage of Super Mario Bros. 3 in it. The two big films did not have huge stars at the time of release, but big critical support suggesting these were Academy Award nominees helped them out a lot. The first was The Magnificent Glory, which is a must-see. Although Glory only made $26.9 million on an $18 million budget, it would go on to win 3 Oscars, including Denzel Washington's first. Driving Miss Daisy would go on to make $106.5 million and be the big winner for the year in Oscars later. During the week Tango and Cash arrived, Oliver Stone released Born on the 4th of July with Tom Cruise. Jessica Lange discovered her father had terrible secrets in the music box, and none other than Steven Spielberg released a film, and it was expected to be huge. However, the film did fine, making $43.8 million. With all these films came Tango and Cash. On its opening weekend, the duo Cops came out second behind National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, pulling in $12.2 million. During the following week, no new movies came out. This meant that the film made almost the same amount of money and remained in the number 2 spot. Yet, The War of the Roses took the number 1 spot, since Christmas was now behind everyone, and they chose something besides a holiday movie. Vacation dropped drastically to the 5th spot. On January 5th, a small movie came out called Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. It offered little threat to current releases, making just $609,000. On January 12th, Tango and Cash stayed strong at the number 3 spot when 4 new movies hit screens. Internal Affairs with Richard Gere, Leatherface, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, The Silly Ski Patrol, and another buddy cop film called Downtown. But Tango and Cash was unshakable. On its 5th week, it went back up to the number 2 spot, despite 3 more movies coming out, and the first one we will cover on our channel in late 2025 or early 2026. And that film was the fantastic Tremors. Nick Nolte and Deborah Winger tried to prove the innocence of a teenager in Everybody Wins, and another horror film called Brain Dead was released. By the time February 2nd came around, Tango and Cash was still in the top 5, and once again 4 movies came out, but only a few stuck around longer than 2 weeks. The biggest of the 4 was Stella. Men Don't Leave would make 6.0, and the hippie flick Flashback would make about the same with 6.4 million. It was thought Heart Condition would make money thanks to Denzel being lifted up as an Oscar contender that year, but in the end it only made 4.1 million. During the week of February 9th, 2 disappointments were released alongside with a big one. It was thought Stanley and Iris's Star Power would make some money with Jane Fonda and Robert De Niro, but instead it only made 5.8 million. Another film that bombed was Gene Hackman trying to deal with Dan Aykroyd, who had a multiple personality in Loose Cannons. It was also kind of another buddy cop movie. Yet the movie that would win the week was Steven Seagal's Hard to Kill. It took the number 1 spot and would eventually make $47.4 million. After this week, Tango and Cash fell off the top 10 and earned a respectable $63.4 million. And we will end this video here. In our next video, we are going to change things up a bit, as our film analysis will actually be how different the shooting script was from the film we got. So if you think you know a lot about Tango and Cash, well, yeah, you know what clip I'm going to use.
Yeah, you don't know shit. What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? Relax. Soap.
We will see you next time. If you like what you see here, click like and subscribe. Super thanks helps. Sharing also helps a lot.